So as we've been talking the last few weeks about the position of widows within the church, and I think in many ways we can extrapolate that towards not only women who are real widows in our church, actual widows who have lost their husbands, but also we find ourselves beset with a real social problem, and that's single moms. There are some single dads, and I'm not ignoring you, but the vast majority of families in our country are now led by single women who are trying to raise their kids, and that is a very difficult situation, not only financially, but it's really is a drain on their energies, because they oftentimes are running double duty, holding a job, coming home, getting kids at daycare and so forth and so on, and then taking them to games and to church, and on it goes. But even you add to that the emotional struggle, that suddenly there's a whole aspect of your children's emotional needs that you are not called by God to supply. And oftentimes we have to pray that God would bring really mentors into the life of our children. If he doesn't even bring replacement fathers and husbands, I find nothing wrong with that. In fact, one of the things that Paul says his counsel is in verse 14 is that the younger widows marry, and they have children, and they manage their homes so that they can give no opportunity for slander, for the enemy to slander against us. So it's one of these things that Paul said, if you're a single mom and you want to be married, you're not doing something wrong. You're not in sin. In fact, he counsels you to do that. But keep in mind, he also counsels in 1 Corinthians 7 that you only marry somebody who is a believer. And this is a tough challenge, because it's really hard to find single men today who are mature and who would make good husbands and fathers. The reality is most of those guys are already married and maintain their families. And oftentimes a lot of the men who are single and available bring a lot of baggage with them, and really many times have become single because they struggle with their own selfishness. So when you're a single woman and you find a man who is a Christian, he is a believer, he loves God, and he loves you, and he loves your kids, you found something that is very special. And I think it might be safe to say that God brought that person into your life. And we have family members in our life as single parents that we pray for them, that God would provide that kind of person. We pray earnestly and fervently that God would bring just that person in, because we understand from experience how rare and few and far between those kind of men of character are to be found in today's culture, today's society. But that's why Paul said, if you are a woman who is a believer, and you have children, daughters or granddaughters who are widows, he said, basically, pray that God would provide a husband for them and to help them raise their children and to manage their homes, because the enemy is going to attack them in a special and aggressive way. That's why he said, give the enemy no opportunity for slander. This was especially difficult in Paul's day, because in those days, a woman who lived by herself was often accused of being a prostitute. And that's why it was so important that when a woman went outside, as Paul would say to the Corinthians, that she went outside with her head covered. Because according to Roman law, a woman who had her head covered was not available, and men had to leave her alone. If a man troubled her, he would be committing a crime. But if a woman was outside and her head was uncovered, well, that basically was advertising herself as a prostitute. So there was a lot of opportunity for slander, and single moms, if they weren't taken into the homes and living with their father and their family, were out there on their own. They were open to a lot of accusation of being sexually immoral. In fact, then Paul said, and some of them actually have turned away from the Lord and are following after Satan. So the word he says to the single mom is live circumspectly. Really be dedicated. Focus on developing a relationship with Christ, that he is your husband and he is the father to your children. And God will honor that. The worst thing that you can do is to desperately go around trying to find a husband, because you may succeed. And then if you are desperately seeking to find a husband, you'll tend to lower your standards, and you'll tend to compromise, and you'll tend to make excuses for things that you see in this person that aren't really make them qualified to love you and to care for your kids, and you'll end up with something very, very disappointing. And I know that some women have just out of desperation, they feel like they're so unlovable that they'll just accept anybody who will show them love. They lower their standards. And you're not doing yourself any favors by doing that, because you can basically attract a better quality of person if you are demanding that you only become available or open to somebody who has met those qualifications. And part of that is the whole issue with sexual intimacy. Today, it's almost accepted that people will sleep together before marriage. And the problem is, we know that people who do that tend to have much less success in their marriages, particularly young women who have had multiple sexual partners tend to to be discontent and unhappy with the intimacy in their marriages. Women who have not, if you've only known one man in your life, they tend to have a much higher degree of satisfaction and fulfillment because they're not always going through comparisons. I'm sorry to be so blunt and graphic, but this is just the simple realities of it. And that's why I say it's so important for you to maintain a very high standard, and that if a man is pressing you to have physical intimacy without the commitment of marriage, then right away that's an indication he's not a good choice. I don't care how rich or good looking he is, he's not a good match, and you need to just tell him to walk on down the road. And wait for a man who loves God more than he loves you, because that becomes a critical issue. Why does that matter? Well, think about it. Every one of us can become unlovable. That we can behave in a way, and my wife and I have experienced that over the years, that we both acted and done things and said things that made us angry with each other and irritated, and we've had these petty arguments and stuff, and at that moment, I could say I love you, but I don't like you, and you realize we all have those moments. That's part of building the relationship in many ways, and learning how to walk in love, and humbling ourselves enough to admit that we're wrong more often than we're right. Well, I say all of that because my wife and I have stayed together not simply because we loved each other, but we love God more than we love each other. And the worst thing in our mind is to insult and let God down, disappoint God, and violate God's law by allowing our marriage to fall apart and using what we call the D word, that we made a vow and a commitment to each other. We will never use that D word in relationship to us. It will not be spoken in this home. And we went that far to banish the very word so that it would never, ever enter into a point of conversation. But we do that, why? Because we're so good, or we're so holy, or we're such pure people? No, because we love God, and we know that there's probably nothing more insulting to God than to violate the vows of marriage. So we're here to honor God. I love my wife even when she's not behaving in a very lovely way, for Christ's sake and for the church. And I'll be quite honest, there's times where she's having a mood, and I've learned that the best thing I can do is to come up and put my arms around her and just look her in the face and give her a kiss and say, honey, I love you. Even right now, when you're saying things that hurt my feelings, I love you. And she always crumbles. And I love the same thing when I'm being irritable and snapping because something's bothering me, and she just comes up and puts her arms around me and looks in the face and say, I love you. And, kind of chill out now and stop being so cranky. That's helpful for me, because that's the reason why the marriage survives. But what motivates that? Well, it isn't that we're great psychologists or we figured all this out, because we know that God says that we're supposed to love one another regardless, that we're supposed to forgive each other regardless. So that a man who would try to get you to do something that would violate your commitment to Christ, and I would say this even to those of you who have never been married or are unmarried, and would try to get you to violate the marriage vows by having intimacy before marriage, is not somebody that you should be with. Then somebody once put it, it's not timber that you can build with. It's too warped and twisted, and you need to discard it. It's designed to be burned in the fire, not to be a stud in the house of your life. So I would just simply say it's really, really important, because that's one of the ways in which the enemy needles his way into our lives, and one of the ways that he tries to take us captive. it's basically, he's saying, they've turned away and followed Satan. And the reference, I think, there is a veiled reference to Eve, that she listened to the deceiving words of the enemy, and she ended up following Satan, and what it brought was death into her life. And I would just, really say the same is true, that if you listen to some guy who's making you promises, sweet promises, and then asks you to violate your conscience or your commitment to Christ, just kick him on down the road and say, no, you're not the man for me. I want a man who loves God, because I don't want to be caught up in Satan's devices. Well, I hope this has been interesting, and I even hope more so that it's been helpful. But we'll continue our conversations next week as we continue to deal with this topic at least one more time before we continue. God bless you and go in His grace.